Confession of a Muslim Nanny's Betrayal, a True Story of Infidelity. It all began on a balmy summer morning in Virginia. The air was thick with warmth, and I could sense my scarf adhering to my neck as I lingered outside the unassuming brick house. This marked the beginning of my professional journey in America. A stark contrast to the dusty streets of Karachi, my hometown. Returning home, I could never have envisioned parting from my family or my little universe. Yet life had its own surprises in store for us. The Johnsons, an apparently ideal family of 4, were in search of a nanny, and I was in need of the income. It wasn't merely about the paycheck. It was about demonstrating to my parents and siblings that I had the capability to succeed, to flourish in a country so distinct from my own. I was 28, single, and fiercely self-reliant. A unique position for a woman in Pakistan. I recall the initial encounter I had with them. Lisa Johnson, the wife, exuded elegance and beauty. She donned fitted blouses and high-end heels that echoed against the marble floors of their expansive residence. She welcomed me with a radiant smile, her blonde hair elegantly arranged in a bun, and spoke in that intentional manner typical of Americans, as if each word held significant weight. Next came David Johnson, the spouse. He stood tall, exuding a natural charm that effortlessly made you feel comfortable. His sandy brown hair curled slightly at the ends, and his laugh lines hinted at a man who had experienced joy, not merely stress. He remained mostly silent that day, merely nodding in acknowledgement as he offered me a cup of tea. Sophie and Max, aged 6 and 3, brimmed with energy and an unquenchable thirst for questions. I was, naturally, a bit anxious. I had never taken on the role of a nanny before, but Lisa confidently assured me that my experience as the eldest of 6 siblings would be more than enough. She exhibited kindness, yet it was evident that she held a perfectionist's mindset. She presented me with a hefty binder filled with regulations, meal plans, daily routines, emergency numbers, and even instructions for folding laundry. The initial weeks passed without any notable events. I would rise at 6 a.m., whip up breakfast, assemble Sophie's lunch for school, and keep Max engaged until it was time for his nap. My days were filled with tales, vibrant colors, and the joyful pursuit of Max around the backyard. At night, I would find solace in my small room in the basement, weary yet satisfied. It wasn't until one afternoon, about a month into the job, that I became aware of David observing me. I was seated on the kitchen floor, cleaning up a spill that Max had created with his juice box when I sensed his gaze upon me. "You're incredible with them," he remarked, leaning against the counter. I glanced upward, taken aback. "Thank you very much, kind sir. They are truly remarkable children." "Please call me David," he said, smiling. I nodded, warmth flooding my cheeks. It wasn't what he said, but the manner in which he conveyed it, as if he truly believed in his words. At home, men seldom addressed women with such warmth, unless they had hidden intentions. Yet David appeared to be an exception. From that day, I started to pay closer attention to him, noticing how he always inquired if I had eaten lunch, how he offered to assist with the groceries, and how he would linger in the kitchen while I cooked. Lisa, in contrast, frequently missed out, occupied with her demanding corporate career. Do you ever feel exhausted? One evening, as I was setting the dining table, David inquired. "Weary of what?" "Of catering to the needs of all." I shrugged. "It's my profession. I'm accustomed to it." "You shouldn't have to be," he said, his voice gentle. His words resonated within me long after he departed the room. It felt peculiar, being observed in such a manner. In my culture, women were anticipated to provide unceasingly, to serve without hesitation. However, David's words filled me with a sense of appreciation. I attempted to brush it aside, naturally. I reflected on my identity and the principles I held dear. I was a woman of deep conviction, shaped by my beliefs and customs. There were boundaries I could never breach, regardless of how gracious or charming my employer might be. However, as I would soon discover, life had different intentions. The summer unfolded like a vast canvas, with days that seemed to linger, drenched in warmth. As Lisa's work trips became more frequent, David and I found ourselves alone with the children. Gradually, the lines started to fade. Initially, it was pure, exchanged laughter, fleeting looks, and easy chats that lingered just a bit longer than intended. Yet, beneath the surface, I was aware that I was navigating treacherous territory. I frequently recalled my mother's voice. Firm and resolute, Zara, keep in mind your true self. This world will entice you, yet you must remain faithful to your essence. I had always taken great pride in my self-discipline. My knack for resisting the allure of worldly temptations. However, David stood apart. A rainy evening set the stage for a shift in events. The children lay in slumber. The house enveloped in stillness, save for the gentle rhythm of rain drumming on the windows. I was in the kitchen, tidying up after dinner, when David walked in. Looking for assistance? He inquired, pushing up his sleeves. No, it's fine, I'm nearly finished, I responded, but he lingered regardless. We toiled in quietude for some time, the atmosphere thick with unexpressed thoughts. At last, he shattered the stillness. Do you ever long for the comforts of home? He inquired. Each day, I acknowledged, but I arrived here for a purpose, to create a better life. He remarked, his tone laced with respect. I gazed at him, taken aback. What makes you say that? From my perspective, your selflessness, and the way you prioritize others, along with your unwavering composure, are truly exceptional. His words took me by surprise. No one had ever addressed me in such a manner before, not even in my hometown. A peculiar blend of appreciation and remorse washed over me, as if I were violating something hallowed merely by being attentive. It's just an ordinary thing, I replied, downplaying the praise. It is to me, he replied, his gaze intertwining with mine. In that instant, a change occurred between us. It was delicate, nearly undetectable, yet it existed. A connection, a spark. A quiet understanding of something neither of us had the courage to label. I lay down that night with a weight on my chest. Caught in the struggle between my beliefs and the undeniable emotions that were surfacing. I sought fortitude, insight, and the bravery to remain steadfast on the correct journey. Yet, beneath the surface, I sensed that my reality was on the brink of transformation in ways I could never have foreseen. I believed I could maintain a professional demeanor, that the transient bond one sensed with David would dissipate like a fleeting shadow, yet existence is seldom that straightforward. Every day unfolded with fresh moments. Minor and seemingly trivial at first glance, yet each one chipped away at the barrier I'd constructed around my heart. Lisa's absence turned into a regular occurrence. She was heading to conferences in New York, attending business meetings in Chicago, or enjoying overnight stays at luxury hotels I had only glimpsed in magazines. David took on the role of the steady parent, while I joined him as his companion in the everyday whirlwind of raising Sophie and Max. The children were completely enamored with him. Sophie would settle onto his lap during story time, her tiny hands gripping his shirt as he animatedly read aloud in whimsical voices. Max trailed behind him, echoing his every action with precision. Observing them together, I noticed a facet of David that was gentle and open, and it awakened something within me that I couldn't quite identify. One afternoon, while I was folding laundry in the living room, David walked in carrying a box. I thought you might like this, he said, placing it on the coffee table. What is it? I inquired. Wiping my hands on my apron. He lifted the lid of the box, unveiling a collection of cookbooks. I saw you've been experimenting with new recipes recently. I thought this might spark some inspiration for you. I gazed at him, utterly at a loss for words. The essence lay not in the gift itself, but in the sentiment that accompanied it. No one had ever seen the small gestures I made, much less valued them. Thank you, I murmured, the words trembling as they lodged in my throat. It's nothing, he replied. Yet his gaze conveyed a different story. That evening, once the children had drifted off to sleep, David and I found ourselves back in the kitchen. These quiet moments after the chaos of the day had transformed into a sort of ritual. I was cleaning the counters when he began to speak. Do you put in a lot of effort, Zara? I glanced upward. Taken aback. It's my vocation. No, he said, shaking his head. You exceed the expectations of your role, you show concern, you cherish these kids as if they were your own. They're simple to adore. I remarked, attempting to divert the conversation. Indeed, you are. The words lingered in the air between us, thick and perilous. I stood still, uncertain of how to react. David, I started. But he cut me off. I'm sorry, he said hastily. I regret saying that. No, it's fine, I replied, even though it truly wasn't. We lingered in quietude, the heaviness of his words bearing down upon us. I wanted to express to him that he was mistaken, that I wasn't simple to love, that I was intricate and imperfect and constrained by principles he could never grasp, yet I remained silent. The days slipped away in a haze. I attempted to persuade myself that everything remained the same, yet beneath the surface, I was aware that it had shifted. David's presence filled the space. His laughter resonating throughout the house, his scent hanging in the air, his voice replaying in my thoughts long after he had left. I started to observe the subtle details about him. The way his eyes crinkled with a smile, the way he hummed softly while washing the dishes, and how he always ensured the kids expressed their gratitude and politeness. He wasn't merely kind. He possessed a thoughtfulness that felt both rare and precious. One afternoon, while I was pushing Max on the swing in the backyard, David emerged with a tray of iced tea. I thought you could use a break, he remarked, offering me a glass. Thank you, I replied, accepting it with appreciation. We lingered on the porch steps, observing the children at play. Do you ever ponder what your life might have unfolded into? He inquired abruptly. I gazed at him, taken aback. What do you mean? I mean, if you'd stayed in Pakistan. If you hadn't come here. All the time, I admitted, but I arrived here with a purpose. I sought greater things for myself. And have you discovered them? He inquired, his eyes unwavering. I paused, uncertain of how to respond. In some ways, yes, but in others it's complicated, he nodded, as if he grasped the nuance. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? It does, I agreed. My voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, we sat there in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I wanted to tell him how much his kindness meant to me. How his presence had become a comfort in a world that often felt lonely and foreign. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. That night, I lay awake in my room, staring at the ceiling. I thought of my family back home, of my mother's prayers and my father's stern warnings. Stay true to your faith, they had always said. Never forget who you are. I longed to hold on to the image of myself as that girl, the one who prayed 5 times a day, and wore her scarf with pride. Yet, the reality was that I was evolving. And it filled me with fear. The following morning, I did my best to steer clear of David. I occupied myself with chores, maintaining a low profile and concentrating on my tasks. However, by the afternoon, evading him became futile. He discovered me in the laundry room, sifting through a heap of clothes. Zara, he said, his voice gentle. I kept my gaze down. Yes. Are you all right? I'm fine, I said quickly, but he didn't believe me. Please don't shut me out, he said, stepping closer. I understand I crossed a line, but it's not about you, I interrupted, finally meeting his gaze. It's about me. My beliefs. My faith. I understand, he said, but the look in his eye told me he didn't. How could he? I can't, I began, but the words caught in my throat. I can't do this. He nodded slowly, his expression heavy with regret. I apologize, Zara. It was never my intention to put you in an awkward position. You didn't, I replied hastily. That's the problem. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us conveying all the things we couldn't express. I'll give you space, he said finally. Thank you, I whispered, my voice trembling. As he left the room, I felt a wave of relief mixed with an ache I couldn't quite name. I knew I was doing the right thing, but it didn't make it any easier. That night, I prayed harder than I ever had before. I prayed for strength, for guidance, for the courage to stay true to myself. And as I knelt on the floor, tears streaming down my face, I realized something. I wasn't just fighting temptation. I was fighting a part of myself I didn't recognize. The days after our conversation in the laundry room were tense but manageable. David kept his promise to give me space, and I did everything I could to refocus on my job. I threw myself into taking care of Sophie and Max, planning crafts and baking projects that kept us all busy from morning until bedtime. But even as I kept my hands occupied, my mind wandered. To him, David stayed cordial, almost distant. And I convinced myself that this was the best way forward. We could pretend nothing had happened, that the words we'd shared in the laundry room were just a moment of weakness. For a time, it nearly succeeded. Then the tempest arrived. It was a Friday evening, just after the sun dipped below the horizon, when the rain started to fall. The thunder rumbled in first, rattling the windows and causing Max to cling to my leg as I tidied up the dinner table. "Don't worry, Max," I reassured him, lifting him into my arms. "It's just a bit of noise. Let's prepare for bedtime, shall we?" I took him upstairs, sharing his beloved bedtime story as the rain cascaded outside. By the time both children drifted off to sleep, the storm had intensified. The wind howled, and an unsettling silence enveloped the house, contrasting sharply with the turmoil beyond. I descended the stairs, anticipating David in his customary place on the couch. To my surprise, I discovered he stood in the kitchen, gazing out the window with a glass of wine cradled in his hand. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and the gentle illumination of the kitchen light accentuated the defined contours of his jaw. He appeared lost in contemplation, and I lingered in the doorway, uncertain whether to intrude. "You don't drink wine, do you?" he inquired without turning, as if he could feel me there. "No," I answered, moving into the room. "It goes against my beliefs." He nodded, finally turning to look at me. "I suspected as much. You're unique. Is that a negative?" I inquired, a faint smile playing on my lips. "Not in the slightest." He spoke softly, his voice carrying a gentle warmth. "It's refreshing." I occupied myself with wiping down the counters, attempting to dismiss the way his words sent my heart racing. The tension in the room was thick, and I sensed his gaze fixed on me as I focused on my task. "Zara?" He finally broke the silence. "Yes?" I answered, keeping my eyes down. "Can we talk?" I paused my actions and turned to face him. "About what?" "About us," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, my pulse quickening. "There is no us, David." "Then why can't I stop thinking about you?" he asked, stepping closer. "David, please." I started to speak. Yet he cut me off. "I know it's wrong," he said, his voice quivering. "I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I can't help it. I see you every day, nurturing my children, transforming this house into a true home, and I—" He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I've never encountered anyone like you." My breath hitched in my throat. His words echoed all that I had attempted to dismiss, all that I had convinced myself I didn't wish to confront. Yet, as I listened to their words spoken aloud, it became undeniable what was unfolding between us. "David," I murmured, my voice scarcely above a whisper. "You are in a committed relationship. You have loved ones." "I understand." He spoke, his eyes brimming with sorrow. "But Lisa, she's perpetually absent, perpetually occupied. And when she is present, it feels as though we're mere strangers. You're the sole person who makes me feel—" He hesitated once more, as if the words weighed heavily on him. I stood there, caught between the part of me that recognized the wrongness of it all and the part that yearned to feel desired, valued, and acknowledged. David stepped closer, bridging the distance between us. I caught the faint whiff of his cologne, mingling with the wine on his breath. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you want me to stop, I will." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words emerged. My heart raced, and every logical thought I had was fading away. When he reached out to caress my face, I didn't retreat. His fingers were warm against my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. "David," I breathed, but it wasn't a request for him to cease. It was something entirely different. A surrender. He closed the distance between us, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that began gently, then deepened as we succumbed to the emotions we had both resisted for so long. His hand slid down to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, forgetting everything else, Lisa. The children, my faith, my family. In that moment, there was only him. We didn't stop at a kiss. That night, as the storm raged outside, we crossed a line we could never uncross. He guided me upstairs to his bedroom, his touch sparking a flame within me that I had never realized was there. I allowed him to undress me, his hands reverently exploring every inch of my body as if I were something divine. And in his embrace, I felt beautiful, powerful, and completely liberated. It was nothing like I had envisioned. Back home, intimacy was a subject never addressed, a forbidden topic that lingered only in hushed tones behind closed doors. Yet, with David, it felt entirely different. He was attentive, patient, and passionate, awakening feelings within me that I had never imagined. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely desired. When it was over, we lay entwined. The sound of the rain drumming against the windows. I rested my head on his chest, absorbing the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. I was aware that I should feel guilty, ashamed, perhaps even disgusted with myself. Yet I didn't. Instead, I experienced an unusual tranquility, as if I had at last discovered the lost fragment of my being. The following morning, reality struck me with the force of a freight train. While preparing the children for breakfast, I steered clear of David's gaze, the burden of our actions weighing heavily upon me. But when he caught my eye and offered a small, knowing smile, I experienced that same rush of adrenaline I had felt the night before. It didn't end there. Over the following weeks, we found ourselves stealing moments whenever possible. A lingering touch as we passed in the hallway. A whispered conversation in the kitchen after the children were asleep. A hurried embrace behind closed doors. Every time, I convinced myself it would be the final moment. Yet, it never turned out that way. David transformed into my obsession, and I found myself unable to fight against it. He caused me to lose sight of it all. My beliefs, my background, the values I once held so dear. And for a while, I allowed myself to believe that we could maintain this. That we could exist in our own little bubble without the rest of the world discovering it. Yet, beneath the surface, I understood it was fleeting. When the inevitable collapse occurred, it would bring nothing but ruin. The ensuing weeks became a tempest of chaos. A whirlwind of fleeting instances and hushed vows that infused my days with a blend of exhilaration and anxiety. David and I navigated our connection with caution, yet a sense of abandon. We carved out moments for one another in the absence of Lisa. When the children were asleep, or when the house was empty. Each time we touched, I convinced myself it would be the last. But it never was. I experienced a dual existence. By day, I was Zara, the caring nanny who shared bedtime stories, prepared meals, and offered warm smiles to Sophie and Max. Yet, as night descended and silence enveloped the house, I transformed into an entirely different person. Someone who was a part of David, in ways I had never experienced with anyone else. One evening, after the children were settled in for the night, David discovered me in the living room, folding laundry. Lisa had departed that morning for yet another work trip, and the house was strikingly quiet. He stood in the doorway, observing me, his presence enveloping the room before he uttered a word. "Do you ever stop working?" he inquired, a hint of amusement in his tone. I glanced up, unable to suppress a smile. Someone has to keep this place running. He crossed the room and sat down beside me, his thigh brushing against mine. "You're amazing, you know that." I shook my head, laughing softly. "I'm simply fulfilling my responsibilities." "No," he replied, his tone now grave. "You're more than that. You have contributed so much to this family. Far beyond what Lisa, or I could ever achieve." A wave of guilt washed over me at the sound of her name. "That shouldn't be said." "Why not?" "It's true." I averted my eyes, concentrating on the heap of clothes before me. "You love her, David. She's your wife." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I do love her, but not the way I should, not the way I love you." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he couldn't love me, that what we were doing was nothing more than a mistake. But I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew I felt the same way. He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "Zara, look at me." Reluctantly, I lifted my eyes to meet his. The intensity of his gaze made my breath catch in my throat. "You mean everything to me," he said. "I know this isn't right, but I can't imagine my life without you." The tears I had been holding back finally spilled over, and he enveloped me in his embrace, holding me tightly as I wept. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I never intended for this to occur." "Neither did I," he said softly. "But I don't regret it." As the weeks turned into months, our affair became increasingly difficult to conceal. Lisa's absences allowed us to explore our secret connection. Yet her presence turned every moment into a struggle. I did my best to steer clear of her, feeling a deep shame that made it hard to meet her gaze. She treated me with kindness and trust, completely oblivious to the deception taking place within her own home. "Zara, you've brought so much light to this family," she remarked one evening while we gathered in the kitchen. "I can't imagine how we got by before you arrived." Her words pierced through me, and I struggled to maintain a smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson." "Please call me Lisa," she said with a light laugh. "You're practically one of the family." Her trust only deepened my guilt, yet it didn't deter me. Each night, after Lisa fell asleep, David would seek me out. Occasionally, we would converse. At other times, we would merely embrace, enveloped in the stillness of the home. More often than not, we found ourselves in his bed, entwined in a fervor that made me forget everything else. One evening, after Lisa had departed for a weekend conference, David and I shared a bottle of wine in the living room. I hadn't intended to drink, but he insisted, pouring me a small glass and teasing me until I finally took a sip. The warmth of the wine enveloped me, easing the rigid hold of my self-restraint. "You're beautiful," he murmured, his voice deep and resonant. "Do you know that?" I shook my head, a rush of color rising to my cheeks. "Are you really saying that?" "I'm not," he replied, moving in closer. "You are the most stunning woman I've ever encountered." Before I had a chance to react, he kissed me, his lips meeting mine in a way that left no room for uncertainty. This was more than mere desire. It was an unnameable connection that transcended the physical. His hands found their way to my waist, drawing me nearer, and I felt myself yield entirely. That night, the bedroom remained untouched. Instead, we remained on the living room floor, the flickering light of the fireplace casting. Shadows danced on the walls as we became lost in one another. It was raw, unrestrained, and utterly consuming. The next morning, I found myself waking in his embrace, the memories of the night before lingering in the air, replaying in my mind. I ought to have felt a pang of shame. Yet what washed over me was an unusual wave of contentment. For the very first time, after a long time, I finally felt a sense of belonging. As I dressed and prepared breakfast for the children, David entered the kitchen, his expression gentle. "Good morning," he said, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead. "Morning," I replied, striving to maintain a steady tone. "We need to have a conversation," he stated, his tone now grave. I nodded, fully aware he was correct. We could no longer maintain the illusion that this wasn't occurring. Couldn't continue to dwell in this imagined realm we had built. Yet, even as I consented, a part of me hesitated to release my grip. The days following that night in the living room drifted by in a blur. David and I grew increasingly wild and fervent. I was engulfed by the flames we had sparked. Every second spent in his presence felt like a precious secret, something I held dear yet dreaded. Yet the more time we spent together, the heavier the guilt grew. Lisa returned from her conference the following Monday. Her presence in the house served as a stark reminder of the life David. We were taking it apart, bit by bit. She radiated warmth and cheerfulness, blissfully unaware of the betrayal unfolding in the shadows. Observing her joyful interactions with the children, I was overwhelmed by a profound sense of shame. She was undeserving of such treachery. None of them did. One evening, after Lisa had gone to bed, I found myself sitting on the porch steps, gazing into the darkness. The sky stretched above me, a canvas of crisp air and scattered stars resembling tiny shards of glass. I tightened my scarf around my shoulders, attempting to ward off the chill and the swirling thoughts in my mind. David joined me moments later, his footsteps gentle against the wooden floor. He took a seat beside me, close enough that our shoulders brushed. "You've been silent,"